So we'll gavel us in just about 10 minutes later. I apologize, the Homeless Committee meeting went a little over and then we had to move down here. But call to order the Public Safety Committee meeting for April 18th. It's 12:40 actually. And we'll go and introduce the members present. Mr. Peters.
Pete Peters in the Zoom.
Amy Kumbowski.
Tim Steele.
Forrest Dunbar. Dick Train.
Eric Croft.
Oh, Suzanne DiPietro with the Alaska Judicial Council.
And Brenda Stanfield, I'm on the Criminal Justice Commission.
I'm Quinlan Steiner with Public Defender for the State of Alaska.
Brad Dyson. John Weston.
Great.
And Suzanne.
And Suzanne Kane. Oh, yeah. Suzanne DiPietro has joined us. And Savannah LaFrance has joined us both. We said Pietro, I apologize. Our only item of agenda today is presentation and questions, conversation with the Alaska Criminal Justice Commission. I appreciate all three of you coming. I want to turn it over to you real quick, but apologize. As chair of the Public Safety Committee, I probably should have done this a long time ago. And it was, I think, because we either injected ourselves in or got thrown into a number of these issues sort of as they came up. And having it, if I had it to do all over again, I would have started there and then we'd have that. But better late than never. We'd love to get a grounding on and you guys tell us more about what's been happening with the recommendations from your commission, SB 91 and 54, other bills that have come together. So, Ms. DiPietro.
Well, thanks for having us. So I'm the director of the Alaska Judicial Council. The Judicial Council, by statute, staffs the Criminal Justice Commission. So by virtue of that statute, I also staff the Criminal Justice Commission. I also have in my office Barbara Dunham, who is the project attorney from the commission. She's not here. She's out of town. She's sorry she couldn't make it. But I just want to first say, anytime you have any questions, we would really appreciate a call. We're here to provide information. And I have with me today two of my commissioners from the Criminal Justice Commission. From Fairbanks, we have Brenda Stanfield and Quinlan Steiner from Anchorage, and I'll let them introduce themselves to you, but I thought you might like to hear a little bit from them just about their experience as commissioners and some of the things that they've seen and worked on. And then after they've introduced themselves and said a few remarks, then I have a PowerPoint presentation just to give you an understanding of the data that the commission used when it made its recommendations, why it made its recommendations, what it was trying to accomplish, and I hope that you will interrupt and ask questions at any time during the presentation, because I think our discussion will be more useful to you if you can direct me to close in on the issues that are most of concern to you, because the truth of the matter is I could talk about this for 6 hours without even taking a breath. So there's a lot of information, and I really wanted to focus on what you're interested in. Okay?
So
Great.
let's do that. Just go through me, but we'll just have it go as it goes. And if it gets too slow, we'll do other things. But just as questions come up, just let me know.
And I'm Brenda Stanfield, so I'm with the Interior Alaska Center for Nonviolent Living in Fairbanks. We're the sister program to Awake here in STAR. We have one agency that does both what those two agencies does in Fairbanks. And I was asked to be on the commission and to apply for the commission, and I did, and was then appointed to the commission. And lo and behold, as maybe all of you figured out as your assembly members, wow, having a day job and being a commissioner, how do you fit it all in? And I was thinking, how did you guys all get off work to come here today? But thank you for doing that. But you know, one of the reasons that I feel very passionate about this issue is, and my journey of working with victims over the last 22 years, things have changed, things have evolved within me as I have recognized that there's a whole bunch of pieces and parts, and that we can't just look at just one part of the system. We have to look at all of the system. And one of the parts of the system we haven't looked at is that I started recognizing all of the people's names that were showing up in the police blotter, and the names of the young men that were pulling guns on police officers. And these were the little guys that ran around in my emergency shelter when they were 2. And you know, started thinking about that the trauma that our kids go through and the exposure to things that they go through, these people who are hurting our community in these other ways are people that things happen to. And then we need to look at this in a more holistic approach. And I really am invested in making sure that we create a system that victims feel heard. And one of the things that we hear often is the victim is kind of it's this thing over here. It's like, well, it started the process, but then they feel totally empowered with the process, and figuring out ways, how can we bring the victim back into the process to make sure that their voices are heard and that they're getting resolutions that seem like it puts them back to whole also. So I committed to this work. Chris Sell, Lieutenant Sell, one time with law enforcement, she said, I came to this meeting and I crossed my arms and I thought, I'm never going to buy into this. And then it all made sense. And I think her and I had the same experience. When we started looking at data, when we started looking at the numbers, I think we both experienced a large change in our thinking. And one of the reasons that we felt very comfortable with the recommendations that went forward, and stand by very much those recommendations, that this is doing the right thing for Alaska.
Quinlan?
Thank you. I'm Quinlan Steiner. I'm the public defender for the state of Alaska. I've been a public defender for 20 years now, but I've been working towards being a public defender for years before that. I volunteered initially at the Public Defender Agency as an investigator. I interned there through law school, and went to work with the agency right after law school. So I've essentially been studying criminal law and criminal justice policy straight for the last 24 years. As public defender, a big portion of what I do is comment on criminal legislation. From my experiences as a criminal defense lawyer, I testify about the impacts and sort of the practical implications of how the laws play out in courtrooms and in our communities. I was appointed to the commission by statute, and I was been a member of the commission from the beginning throughout. There were multiple subcommittees of the commission dealing with the separate issues that were addressed in the reform effort. I participated in essentially all of those subcommittees and all of those meetings because of the specialized knowledge that I was able to bring to it. And what the commission focused on and what the commission recommended really focused in three areas that sort of, by experience, was borne out by the data sort of predictably from my perspective, because I had a lot of experience with it. And it really focused on pretrial and separating decisions about pretrial release from money and making it more about risk assessments and the concepts that swift reactions to events are more effective than delayed reactions, and that short sanctions, proportional sanctions, are as effective and more effective than longer ones. And again, towards the back end of cases, which is supervision. That supervision combined with incentives, guaranteed incentives, and training and assistance actually helps people move from the criminal justice system and impacts to out of it. Those are the experiences that we had coming into it, and then the data was very clear and supportive in these initiatives. So those were sort of the foundations of the three main areas that we discussed, and the same goes for the subsequent alterations to criminal justice reform. We're really refining those areas to make sure that they were consistent with the policy that was intended, and to gain the effects that were intended. I'm happy to answer any questions about that process or as we go along.
Yeah, Dick, let me just, Fred, you were involved at the beginning and then Coghill subs out for you on this? Or
Yeah.
did you want to say, if you were, so you were somewhat of a founder, did you want to say anything or did you wait for questions?
Yeah, I'll wait.
Okay. Mr.
Thanks.
Trainee.
I appreciate you being here. Just a few questions. I've heard that people are released from the Department of Corrections after being in prison are sent back to Anchorage, not back to the town they came from where the crime was committed. In reality, are we housing all the people getting out of the Department of Corrections
There's
facilities?
a lot of reality to that. So people will
Why?
Part of it is requirements for probation supervision.
Well, you should mention though that the statute is that when you're released from corrections, you're sent back to the place where you were apprehended or where you came into the system. So that happens. We don't have any information that that's not happening, that people aren't getting sent back. But
They can be sent back, but the problem is.
Yeah, but there is a problem.
There's
yeah.
conditions of probation that require certain treatment.
Right.
And that can be very specific,
Yes.
right? And then those individuals can only be supervised in Anchorage or the larger communities that have those programs. And so one of the things that was of concern in all of this is how can suitable programs, rehabilitation efforts be done in smaller local communities for the individuals? Because it's a real barrier for success when people have no support network at all. They can come into this community, have never lived in a city this large, know nobody in the city, have no money or place to live or any support, and that is a recipe for failure.
And what does the state do to offset the impact on the city of Anchorage with the crime that they're going to eventually commit?
Well, I could maybe respond to that a little bit. One of the things that the commission recognized is that we had a lot of people on community supervision. So one of the interesting statistics, and from what let me just back up, from what you may have alluded from what Quinlan said, that the commission's very focused on data and quantifiable information, and the commission decided at the very beginning of its process that it was going to make decisions based on data. And that has been pretty much core to its functioning. So, but so some of the data that the commission had about rates of reoffending on community supervision are that most people who are going to reoffend, or I shouldn't say reoffend, most people on community supervision, so that's probation or parole, who are going to go back to jail, are going to go back to jail within the first 90 days. 62% are going to mess up within the first 90 days. And then we also had data that the average length of probation was like 25 months, even though 90% of people who are going to mess up within the first year, 24 months. So the question was, why are we supervising people for all this time when we know by the data that within the first year we're going to find out whether this person is going to mess up or not 90% of the time. So one of the things the commission did is gave people ways to earn time off their probation, and also limited in some instances the amount of time that a person could be on probation. So that when it starts working would have the effect of shortening this probationary period so that people can, and incentivizing people to get done what they need to get done so that they can be off probation and presumably return to their communities.
Thank you, ma'am. One quick question, Eric, and I'll shut up.
You don't have to.
Bail. It was changed, I understand. They've got some computer formula now. But take a look at what happened with Northway Mall, where a lady shot up Northway Mall. She was arrested. She had a problem with lower 48 where she wasn't even allowed to have a gun. She was a felon.
Mm-hmm.
But they weren't allowed to look outside when they sent her bail. So, of course, when her trial came up, she was already gone again. And that's a problem we've seen. So how did that fall through the cracks?
It fell through the cracks because the out-of-state database that keeps track of criminal histories, the data wasn't released for the formation of that tool, so that information wasn't taken into account. Now there's two bills in the legislature right now to address that problem. There's one in the House and one in the Senate that are both slightly different, but essentially address that issue by switching from a mandatory OR release when there's an out-of-state history to the presumptive OR release, allowing the judge to make a finding about whether or not monetary bail is appropriate.
Hey, can I just make one comment about that case? She was not charged with a violent crime.
Shooting in the building is not a violent crime?
She was not charged with that.
She
I
was
said
charged with
I don't know what
felony
she
possession.
did, but she wasn't charged with that. I'm just saying it's important to know what the person is charged with to understand the bail laws. So she was charged with being a felon in possession, which it's not in the category of violent crimes. It's a felon possessing a gun against the law. It is a crime. If she had been charged with a violent crime, the bail consideration would have been different.
But what's in consideration when somebody's in the presumptive realm is really about bail release. Constitutionally, you're entitled to bail. So the judge has to set a bail that's at the least restrictive possible to address two things. One is whether or not somebody will appear again, and the other one is whether or not they'll commit a crime or present some other threat. It's really a difference between, and what I discussed earlier was, are people being released because they have money, or are they being released with appropriate conditions because the conditions are tied to their risk level? And that was the major shift, because what was clear from the commission was people were being held in jail because they were poor, and they were being released because they had money, when the same level of risk exists. There was no correlation between the two. And in fact, it was shockingly low amounts of money that were keeping people incarcerated on very low-level offenses. So one of those two bills will address that problem if it gets through.
If they make it through the legislature.
There's one in the House that has certain parameters to it. The Senate one's a little different, but they both address the issue.
Well, thank you for responding to us, because the public does not call you guys. I guarantee the public calls us. Our phones ring off the hook because we're impacted here locally. It's easier to call us. Thank you, Eric.
I have Mr. Constantine, and I wanted to get a grounding before we dived into the particulars, but just on that issue, and Quinn and I have discussed this before, but frank and vigorous discussion. You guys emphasized data, and I understand from a short stint as a municipal prosecutor how the out-of-state data is less reliable than what we have here. We charge on it, we have a certain sense that it is true, but it's both not maintained quite as well and sometimes difficult to determine exactly what that crime was because other states define things differently. So I found both of those to be true, and that's accurate. But then the conclusion that you drew in legislation was to ignore it entirely.
That wasn't done by legislation.
That was
the
DOS.
quirk of how the tool was developed, because absent the local state database would release all the data with names of individuals, their histories, and what happened to them. They could create a tool that the NCIC, which is the out-of-state, is managed federally, and they don't release the data for study for these purposes. Now, what can happen is, because we are going through this process, we can now collect the data from NCIC relative to our population. It can be added to the tool in the future as part of this, but presently it's not, because we don't have the data to do it.
Isn't that a fundamental misuse of data to say we've got very reliable data that there is a correlation between crimes in state and both coming back when you are asked for trial, reappearing, and whether you're going to commit another crime? And we're going to categorically exclude from our model this out-of-state data, which was done. Fred's shaking his head, but it was. That's why the legislation now before the House and the Senate has to be passed, is because it was categorically included. You're saying it wasn't your recommendation or done by statute, it was done by the way they did the process.
It was
It was
done
the
by the way they
FBI.
created the tool.
Well,
No, the
okay, wasn't
FBI
that a
won't-
misuse of data to create a tool that ignored something that had that logical relevance?
Can I answer? So let me. So the development of the tool, there is no tool that we're aware of in the United States that uses NCIC data. Why? Because the FBI won't give it to the developers of the tools. I mean, it's sort of like we could argue about wouldn't it have been good to have it, but you couldn't have it. Like they won't give it to you.
They give it to, we present it in bail hearings all the time.
Right, they'll
have
give,
forever.
yes,
That's
yes.
what's being collected, so
Right.
that it can be
They'll
controlled
give,
for the future.
they'll give, you can have the criminal history of a single defendant who's before you.
Right.
But you cannot have in the aggregate, you cannot say to the FBI, give me all the out-of-state criminal history. So the tool was developed with about 40,000 records.
That's what I mean. So
You-
we're starting to interrupt each other, but
Yeah.
that's what I meant, that isn't that a fundamental misuse of data to say, I'm creating a tool based on the data I have. There's this analogous, not quite as reliable, but analogous data of criminal convictions in other states, and I'm going to categorically exclude it
So from a
from
victim,
consideration on an individual bail decision.
from a victim's perspective, so when we, so I'll just talk about what we did as a commission, because I think this is a very important, especially when you're talking about victims of domestic violence, where oftentimes they have to cross state lines, they have to flee, and we need that to be considered. So when we were putting these recommendations together and saying this is what the data shows, there was in nobody's mind that we weren't going to be considering out of state. This is something that came up as the tool was being created,
Right.
because it was tasked with a department to create this tool and to make this happen and to set up the pretrial.
Yeah.
So once we realized that that was happening, that's why this bill is in, to fix this piece of it. It wasn't something we could fix before everything went online. We had to have a legislative session because we didn't realize this was happening until the tool was being created.
But this could have been fixed as the tool was being created. I mean,
It
it
didn't-
should not have been done that way, and we know that by the uniformity of opinion that we should fix it.
Well, we could probably debate that, but from what our understanding was that there was no fix right then with how everything had already been created, is that we couldn't just then pull in this out-of-state data to do it. We would need to change, we need a legislative fix to make sure we could consider the out-of-state data until we can figure out how to get this tool fixed.
The legislature didn't require it, but we require a legislature to mandate that it be fixed.
It's the tool. Let's take a step back. So first of all, the tool was developed with. I'm sorry, I didn't have slides on this. I would have given you more if you wanted to get into the details. But the tool was developed by using about 40,000 records from Alaskans and from Absen getting all their criminal history data and all this information. So all of the people that went into the statistical analysis of the tool in Alaska had and didn't have out-of-state criminal records. So to say that so the tool wasn't able to measure what effect an out-of-state criminal record might have had, but certainly the people that the tool was validated on had and didn't have out-of-state criminal history records. So it's not like that. It's not even for sure that not including it in the tool is really hurting anything, because the tool has measures in it that have proven statistically to be predictive. It's just an actuarial tool. It's like the data that your car insurance company uses to decide that your 16-year-old son is going to have a higher insurance rate than your 50-year-old female relative. It's statistical data, actuarial nature. It's just designed to sort of measure the probability of a particular event occurring. It's designed to measure the probability that a person's going to have a new criminal arrest or that a person's going to fail to appear. And there were literally hundreds of different factors that the developers measured to see whether they were predictive. So in the car insurance example, one factor that the companies have found to be predictive of crashes is gender. Another factor they found is age, right? I mean, you see how this works. It's the same thing in the tool. So the items that are in the tool are predictive. They are predictive together, and they are predictive independently. And really importantly, they are predictive regardless of race or gender, because that was one of the, the developers uncovered certain items that were predictive but had a different predictive effect whether you were Alaska Native or white, whether you were male or female. And those, even they were predictive, threw them out. Why? We don't want a tool that has a different predictive value for different races or different genders. So there's lots of things that could have gone into the tool that didn't go in because there wasn't the data. There's lots of things that could have gone into the tool that didn't go in because they weren't predictive. There's lots of things that could have gone into the tool that didn't go in because they were measuring something that the tool that something else was already measuring, and we don't need to measure it twice. I mean, it's a very complicated actuarial process, and the tool that we have now is predictive. I mean, and I think everyone's saying we could improve that. I mean, we want to improve its predictiveness.
I'm saying a
if we
different
can.
thing than to take as a primary determinant of bail in-state convictions and create a tool that categorically excludes out-of-state. Not identical, but pretty darn similar, is a misuse of data. And whether it was the enabling legislation or the decision that did it, we are trying to fix it now. It also has made just specific illogical results that we're trying to fix now. And so I'm trying to prevent those from happening in the future. We would like your presentation, just very, very briefly. Why should we, I didn't like it when the federal sentencing guidelines took away discretion from federal judges. I clerked for Judge Fitzgerald way back, and there were repeated times of injustices because we couldn't get below a floor set by Congress in a situation. I remember one particular one was, anyway, a guy who grew marijuana in his house, didn't sell, just was staying home, not doing much in the house he grew up in, but it was across from the school he went to. And because it was growing marijuana across from the school, he went away for a long, long time. Why is it a good idea to have a tool that takes away discretion from judges?
This is why. Because what became clear was that judicial discretion in this area resulted in people being incarcerated because they were poor or they were a minority.
And there's another reason too.
And that was abundantly clear. And even the judges through this process had to recognize that making decisions purely on argument without some more objective data was resulting in deeply unfair outcomes. So what you have now is something that's targeted to a more fair outcome, that you're not held in jail just because you're poor, that the conditions upon you and whether or not you have monetary bail upon you is based upon a relative risk level. Now understand that monetary bail itself was also considered a problem and remains a problem. Monetary bail doesn't do anything more than non-monetary bail in assuring that somebody shows up and doesn't commit another crime. It simply and only has the effect of holding somebody in jail. That's it. It doesn't provide any advantage to the community in terms of safety. And that is a very clear reason why these limitations were part of the recommendation.
But another piece of data that the commission had is when in the exercise of their discretion on pretrial release decisions, the judges were making decisions that were holding about 50% of all people were held while their case was being resolved. So there's that statistic. And then of the people who were released under the old system, 37% committed a new crime before their case was resolved. So, I mean, so I don't know. I would say that's maybe not such a great exercise of discretion when 37% of the time the person that the judge decided should be released actually is rearrested during the pretrial period.
Well, that's right. And the federal sentencing guidelines had that same problem with discretion, and they took it away to do it. You can either solve that problem when you see it, judges not sentencing federal criminals to as high as they should, or the problems you've identified, with better training and better, all kinds of different ways, or just by taking it away. Mr. Constable.
Thanks. It's interesting, the reliance, this is predicate. I have been an advocate and supporter of reform, but I am seeing now that there are some major flaws, and it doesn't matter how passionately we believe this database approach is a success, there are some actual impacts on the community that are horrible. And the reliance on actuarial data, if you're trying to compare insurance, car insurance, to Alaska criminal statistics, is vastly flawed, because you have hundreds of millions over time people who are in actuarial tables, and you have a few thousand people in Alaskan experience. And so, although I understand it's a parallel process, the validity of the data is going to be less valid here, I believe, in my opinion. I'm not a statistician. But the number one problem that we're seeing, I think, is that there is a sudden massive increase in, for example, car theft, and then the next car theft, and then the next car theft, 4 or 5 and 6 times, and then they're released still, right? And so it's not just that, it's like the going shopping now at Walmart, Fred Meyer, JCPenney, and just walking out with $500 worth of goods, and then doing it again, and then we have to mount a campaign of multiple police officers working with the loss prevention people at these operations. And so we're effectively having to mount up massive resources because there's no system to stop these processes from occurring now. Is at least what it looks like as a member of the public and a member who hears from the public a lot. What do we do then? Because separate from this very specific issue of out-of-state records, which is one very narrow bandwidth piece, right, which is going to take an act of God because the legislature isn't able to, what are we going to do? What do we do?
The turn in crime statistics occurred well before criminal justice reform was put in place. In particular, the vehicle theft rate started up in 2011 or 2012.
And if you
It's
look,
been steadily
there's a
rising
handout
ever
on that.
since. All the other crime statistics turned at the same time, but have been doing sort of a cyclical, seasonal up and down. But the vehicle theft rate had been fairly consistent, but it started well before. I mean, the genesis of that whole problem, it just started well before reform. The response is to try to get at the root of what's causing people to come into contact with the system, which is overwhelmingly issues of drug and alcohol addiction, mental illness, and targeting systems that will help address those issues are how to address those problems.
So you're suggesting that the solution for APD's problem, Anchorage's problem, with thousands of people having their cars stolen in a given year, and multiple times these people offending and then walking away, re-offending and laughing on the way out the door, is that we should provide them with mental health treatment?
Absolutely, without question.
So
Without question.
I'm a mental health service provider. I have to say that. It's just laughable.
The overwhelming majority of people who are in custody have these baseline issues that are driving their contacts with the system. And what was clear from all the data is if you fund programs and create incentives to participate in programs, those individuals succeed at much higher rates. If you don't address those issues, they will continue to come back into contact with the system.
Can I ask you for clarification on that, Assemblymember Constant? So are you saying that when you say that people come back and do it again, are you saying that they're convicted and they go to prison and they come back
Oh,
out?
no, they don't ever get into conviction.
You're saying,
they never actually are. It's tossed out at the door over and over and over again.
It's tossed out at the door? You
Yeah,
mean they're not charged?
They may
Wait.
be charged. They walk out, but it's based on conviction, and convictions just aren't happening.
So that's not quite accurate. I mean, I don't know if convictions are happening or not, so I don't know about that. I mean, I assume that this process is going like it usually goes. But once a person is charged with a violation of conditions of release, they fall into a new bail category. And if the judge is still releasing that person, it's not because they have to.
Mr. Croft?
I had Mr. Dunbar and then Mr. Senator Dyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So yeah, while we've been discussing this, I've been trying to read through because there's a ton of data here, and it really is remarkable looking at all these different graphs, and it's clear that the spike in violent crime in Anchorage started in 2014. So the current spike in violent crime.
Yeah.
But I guess so. My question is actually more to the chairman. What's the game plan right now? We've got a half hour left or 45 minutes.
I told Suzanne to do a half-hour presentation.
Are we going to go through this presentation, or because there's a lot of really interesting graphs here and data here. There's a thing on SB54, and I'm just sort of curious, like what we're going to do.
Well, we knew we had too much for it, but we also knew we wanted to have it. They asked the questions being first, and you guys are asking a lot of questions, including you, Senator Dyson.
Yeah, I'm having trouble not reacting to what appears to me to be ignorance or demography. Your idea that somehow or the other, your implication that people that framed that stuff didn't want out-of-state information to be available to the judge and so on. And that really wasn't the issue, and you realize that. So. But anyways, it's never purpose that being excluded, and the implication that the policymakers who did this didn't want the out-of-state information available is erroneous. They didn't decide they didn't want it. They were forced by the circumstances on the aggregate information, in my opinion. This whole thing was a perfect storm of all the people that didn't have it. We expected that somebody gets arrested, they would be tried and released or convicted within a reasonable short time. Particularly, the court system is so backed up that people were getting 6 or 7 arrests and never getting to court. So the penalties for repeat things weren't happening, not because of a flawed law, but because the court system couldn't keep up. The same is true with parole and pretrial release. It was only this January that the state put those people on to do that very thing. And the court system is overworked and did not have the resources, even on a clerical level and so on, to take care. Quinton didn't have the public defenders, to do that. So all those things didn't happen. And as we all ought to know, legislators can only change ordinances and budget. And all the things that were responsibility of the court system and the executive branch, the legislature can't control. Somebody should have said, the administration and in court, we're not ready yet for this thing to be laid on the table and start operating. That kind of coordination didn't happen, and it's really too bad, and we're all suffering from it, including the credibility.
Do you want him to repeat the question?
Well, I do have to follow that.
Well,
Yeah, let's go on.
the data you handed us, which we very much appreciate, it was a big packet here, but shows violent crime starting in 12 or 11 and on a pretty consistent spike that the slope doesn't seem to have been changed considerably in 15.
Yeah,
Shows property crimes were on a slight decrease and go way up in the 15-16 time frame. Shows larceny going down more significantly and then going way up in the 15-16 time frame. And shows motor vehicle theft on its way back from a very low rate, on its way back up
Right.
from 11 or 12,
Right.
and then just going through the roof in
Right.
the 15-16.
Right. I
So-
mean, I gave you
So just to be clear, there does seem to be an inflection point as this came on for a lot of this data. Not really on violent crime, but in a lot of the other.
You've got to look at the monthly data.
Well
It started well before, and it was on a consistent upward
Yeah.
trend with monthly ups and downs that related to the seasonal variation that we see in certain crimes, with the exception of murder in the higher level cases, which aren't seasonal and can't be sort of judged in the same way.
Yeah.
Everything else was sort of seasonally fluctuating, except vehicle theft, which just started up, it stayed up, and it's not
So
changing. But what did happen after the
That's
passage?
not what this data shows.
You got to look at the monthly data.
there's a monthly
That's
breakdown.
more refined and you can understand. And what actually happened after the passage was all the other crime indicators went down. But they just went down because it was the end of summer.
Yeah.
There's no correlation one way or the other between that at this point.
But the really interesting thing about the reason I gave you this crime data, you'll look at those spikes. I mean, look at these interesting trends. I mean, the fact and what's happening in Anchorage isn't necessarily what's happening in other places. So, property crime had decreased 20% statewide in the 10 years before criminal justice reform. Well, yeah, between 2005 and 2014, it had decreased about 5% in Anchorage. So property crime for the past 30 years has been on a downward trend. Violent crime, Alaska's a violent place. It always has been, it still is, has been either flat or slightly up for the past 30 years. And you can break down types of violent crime, you can break down types of property crime. Those statistics are a little bit different in Anchorage, they're a little bit different in Fairbanks, they're a little different in the North Slope boroughs. So each community has to pay attention, obviously, to its own crime, which is why I gave you some Anchorage graphs. And we have lots of others. If you're interested in particular crimes, we can give you those. I just took an example. But the point is, SB 91, criminal justice reform is a statewide reform. It's based on statewide data. And the fact that crime is different in different communities, I think, is a good indication to us that, I mean, it's hard to say that one statewide law has caused a crime trend when the crime trends are different in different communities. Which crime trend did it cause? It's a statewide law. Crime going down in the North Slope borough, going up in Anchorage, and Fairbanks, I don't know what it's doing in Fairbanks. I haven't looked recently. So I just want to say, correlation and causation, you've heard it before, but these crime trends are complicated. The causes of crime, books and books and books have been written. I just don't think we can be simplistic and reductionist when we look at crime rates. And, you know, everyone has their favorite theory about what does or doesn't cause a crime rate. So, I mean, when we went out to, you know, Wasilla and Palmer, their crime rates went like this. One was going up, one was going the other way. I mean, what explains this? It's very local. It's very geographically localized, crime is. And we have to watch the crime rates. We have to pay attention and try to respond. But we can't, it just doesn't make any sense to try to pin a change on a sentencing law. It doesn't really, it doesn't connect, and the data just don't support that. Many other things cause crime.
Can I ask a follow-up to Mr. Constant, I think? So in Fairbanks, my mom laughed one time because I told her, oh, you know, there's hardly any crime here. Sometimes I don't lock my door. And she said, didn't you have like 6 cars stolen? Like, and I'm like, oh, I actually have had 6 cars stolen. She said, I've never had a car stolen. But I mean, in our location, like, people get cold. You leave your car running in the driveway. They drive it over to wherever they're going, and they leave it there. Is that the kind of car theft you have, or do you guys have where they're chopping the cars and taking them off?
You know, the APD will tell you that there's like a 93% return rate, but in the 93% return rate, I have a number of social contacts who their car was returned completely totaled.
Yeah.
Or chopped apart, or in any number of ways. But
Yeah.
primarily it is, you know, an active crime to an active crime.
Yeah.
And, yeah, there is that. I have a question about the commission. Is your commission just the crime bill, or is it crime issues across the state in general? Right, because we had a little sidebar conversation where, you know, it can be shown that the law allows the judge discretion, but what we're seeing is that the judges are either not exercising that discretion, or as what Mr. Dyson said, they have 6 cases with the same person start rolling before they get to the first one through the procedure. Isn't there a challenge to you as a commission then to analyze what's broken and try to fix it, not just kind of, you know, what appears to be rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic? And it may prove to be very viable over time. And again, I'm a supporter of crime reform because of the equity issues that have been talked about. My neighborhood is the one that has the most disparate treatment. But
Yeah.
that's the question I have is, what's your
The-
attack on?
The commission, the commission has a very broad mandate to look at all kinds of different criminal justice issues. I mean, it actually is about a page worth of a list of mandates, and the commission has looked pretty broadly. And I do want to assure you on the pretrial release, you know, that's only been in effect since January. And the Department of Corrections is collecting data, and we're going to be collecting data, and the tool's going to be revalidated within the next year or so, which is mandatory. So, you know, I hear you saying that you have decided that there is a problem, and
I thought there was agreement on that. I mean,
Right.
I watched some members testify that it was appropriate to change.
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
so-
no, I'm saying in terms of the specific,
We've all decided
the
that-
specific problem that he's talking about, not the out of state.
Okay. And
Anyway.
we're up to 35 minutes left, and we
Yeah, I
haven't
know.
let you start your presentation. I think there's
Well-
some metaphor in us being in the dark here, but it
So-
was mainly to let you do your presentation.
Okay, so I'll just give you some background on the reasons that the commission decided to recommend reform. The prison population had been growing. That was going to be expensive. We were spending a lot of money on prisons and public safety, and we were not getting very good outcomes. So the recidivism rate was around 2/3. And so what does that mean? That means that for every person who came out of prison, they returned to prison within 2/3 returned to prison within 3 years. 2/3 returned to prison within 3 years of being released, and that may have been for a new crime. It may have been for a supervision violation, but they were returning to prison 2/3. So that's kind of a terrible return on investment, and the commission thought and still thinks that Alaska can do better than that. Also, as you I'm sure know, incarceration rates are racially disproportionate. Alaska Natives and African Americans are incarcerated at double or more than double their representation in the population. And as Commissioner Steiner recommended, pretrial detention was based not on the risk of a person's reoffending, but on whether they could pay or not. And the commission had information that there were people who could come up with the money to make bail who were high-risk people, and then there were people who were low-risk people, unlikely to reoffend, who could not come up with the money to make bail, and so were detained. So here's the prison population growing. Spending on Department of Corrections increased 60% over 20 years. And that was about $126 million in 1995, and it was up to $327 million in 2014. Also, this prison population growth was growing faster than the population was growing. So one of the things that you know is that the prison population is tied, generally speaking, to the population of the state. As the state's population goes up, the prison population generally goes up. Well, our trend was faster than any rate of population growth in the state, and our prison utilization rate went up. So that's the rate per X number of people that the state was imprisoning. So all these were trends that were interesting. You know, here we are, we're putting more people in prison, we're increasing our spending, and we still got this rotten 2/3 recidivism rate. So then the commission took a look at, well, who is in prison? Well, when we think of prison, we think of people serving sentences. Well, it turned out only about half the people sitting in state prisons actually had been sentenced. About 22% were these supervision violators. Those are people who are on probation and mess up and have to go back. And these are people who they haven't necessarily committed a new crime, but they've broken the rules, and so they're sitting back in prison because they broke the rules and they were on community supervision. And then
One of the things that's really important about this large number of supervision violators is the state had relied heavily on what's called surveillance probation, where you don't provide services to individuals. You simply just wait for them to make a mistake and then you arrest them. And those programs have zero effect on recidivism. They don't do anything. They're just scooping people up when they make a mistake. And usually what happens is they make many before they even bother to do anything about it. And so one of the initiatives that we recommended was to address those supervision violations right away, like that day when it first happens, and that person will go into custody for a very short period of time. Those individuals had improvement rates that were remarkable. And so many of the initiatives that we recommended were based upon that concept, this short, swift, and proportional sanction.
And those
not
guys
only resulted in fewer people in custody, but they came into contact with the justice system less frequently.
Yeah.
That quicker makes proportional both make a lot of sense. And those are a mixture of technical violations which may have been over prosecuted and contacting the victim, or other ones that are really severe.
Correct.
There's this mix of dangerous to technical
And
in that.
in the initiative, we separated
Right.
the technical ones from what are non-technical,
Right.
which is new crimes, domestic violence, or violating
protective order.
Thank
So,
you.
and then 28% were pretrial. So these are the people who are, they're still, by our Constitution, innocent. They haven't been convicted of anything yet, but they can't make bail. And then here's a further breakdown of what was driving the prison growth. So you can see there that the largest increase over that 10-year period was actually in the pretrial inmates, but there were also increases in the sentenced population and in the supervision violation population. And so that is in those three categories. Those are the three categories that the commission made recommendations for reform. Better ways to handle pretrial, better ways to handle sentenced, and better ways to handle supervision violators.
Can I
Yeah.
interject a little comment?
Sure.
One of the reasons that the pretrial aspect of this is so important is when individuals are held in custody simply because they're poor, what's happening is they end up pleading to the case very quickly. And what's associated with that is really only jail time. It's usually a time served offer. They have a bail hearing, they fail to get bail that they can meet, they can't get out, they turn around and end up getting a time served offer very frequently, and then they're released right away. But there's nothing in that whole process that is addressing the underlying issues that brought them there in the first place. And that's really the area where this number is so disturbing. It really sets the whole system on a path that's not going to create a situation where that person's needs are going to be addressed. They're just going to keep coming in contact with the system.
Yeah.
Yeah, Pete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, some of these people that are in pretrial situation, they're used to be all kept here at the Anchorage jail, but I understand that we're both capacity, and some of them are actually
Yeah.
headed out to
It's-
the prison in the valley.
The pretrial population gets moved around quite a bit because they have to go back and forth for court hearings. It's very expensive and it's kind of logistically complex for the Department of Corrections to handle those people, yeah. The bigger that pretrial population gets, the more logistically complex it gets. for
That
them.
is the one that stands out, like 15 and 14 may be proportionate to the
Yeah.
population growth, but that's
Right.
the one that's just out of whack from it.
I know, it's, whoa,
Yeah,
careful.
and it was, people are held in Goose Creek from all over the state, and not just anchors to Goose Creek, they're from everywhere.
But you also have to ask yourself, was there some difference? I mean, why? Why are so many more people being held pretrial? I mean, were they different in 2005 than in 2014? No, I mean, they're kind of the same people. It's just that the practices have
Well, I
changed.
thought they cut the number of prosecutors, and that was creating a backlog.
Do you think, Quinlan,
Well,
that's,
that did
what
happen.
do you think is driving that really different number in the middle? I mean,
That one's particularly difficult. I can tell you
Third
what
party
I've seen as the
custodian.
trend. Over those years, there was an increased reliance on what's called third-party custodian, which was a system that, again, disproportionately impacted people who were poor, didn't have support networks. It's very difficult to find somebody who could spend time with you 24 hours a day. And even in the situations where that was occurring, it wasn't done with much adherence to the rules. There really wasn't much supervision. And that's very different from the system you have now. You have Department of Corrections employees who are doing the supervision. And they're available for that.
we're actually moving through the presentation, but go ahead. Rich.
With the cutback in the judicial system because of dollars, what's the impact of that on this? Because when I hear the goal is to reduce the prison population, the misery index, in other words, the citizens being affected by that is dramatic. So I understand the court system doesn't operate on Friday, is that correct?
Friday afternoons. right.
And so what's the impact of that shutdown on the whole criminal justice system? Cases just freeze where they're at, don't they?
They have procedures so that emergency things can still be done. I would say the larger impact, honestly, probably on the system has been through cuts to prosecutors and the public defenders, actually, but since they're the ones who have to bring the cases, have to
Now, I
get the
know you've
cases
got a public
together.
defender here, but do you have a prosecutor assigned
Oh,
to
yeah.
your commission?
Oh, yeah. The Attorney General.
Okay, I'm just
herself,
wondering why
yeah.
they weren't here too, because I'm hearing from the public defender
Yeah.
on his perspective. I'm not hearing from the prosecutor on their perspective.
I should say on the commission we have,
Well, part of this was to sort of grab, we hear a lot from Seneca and maybe less from our
Yeah.
public defenders, but, so, go on. We were
Okay.
moving, so we can keep moving.
Keep going. Okay, so here's the graph you've probably seen. Department of Corrections only has a certain number of beds that it can handle before it has to send people out of state or build a new prison. And you can see from the projection that we were scheduled to hit that point of no return, really, and that would have cost a lot of money to go over the bed capacity of Department of Corrections, whether you build a prison or whether you send people out of state. And I'll just say a footnote on sending people out of state. Many of the prisoners who were most often sent out of state were people with pretty long sentences, and many of those people were Alaska Native people. And Department of Corrections really was finding that it was particularly hard for Alaska Native people to be in Arizona or Colorado, so far away from their culture. I mean, that's where a family member can't come and visit you. So that's sort of a disparate impact of the idea of sending people out of state. And then we've talked about the crime rates. This is the Alaska crime rates of the state crime rate, not Anchorage, but Alaska. So we were increasing incarceration, and yet crime was going down.
Okay, so I've been listening intently because I love statistics. Everybody
Good.
here knows I love statistics because generally you can get to say whatever you want. But I'm looking at the DOC website right now, and I've been looking at their trends for a long time. And what I'm not understanding is how you're pulling your numbers, because when I look at the number of offenders in institutions, population trends, I'm looking from 2012 to 2016, and the number's actually decreasing significantly. But every single one of your slides looks like the sky is falling and all of a sudden trends are going up. But in fact, from 2005, I mean, I can go back and pull those, and those numbers do trend. But when you say like 2012, 2011 on, the numbers were actually going down, so what were we doing wrong? Or what were we doing right?
I should say that the commission was doing this research in 2014 and 15 actually, and so it was looking at data that went up to 2014. And so any trends that have happened since then weren't actually in the commission's work. And also, criminal justice reform began to go into effect in 2016.
Right.
And has already had an effect on, for example, the percentage of supervision violators. Remember the 22% number? It's now down to about 12%, so that's one big change.
Is that because they're not being followed up on?
You know, actually, the number of, initially, the number of remands for supervision, technical violations increased, but the population still went down. Why? Because of changes to the amount of time they were staying when they were remanded. So there's this new system. You've heard of it. It's what is it? 1-5-10? 3-5-10. So the first time you mess up, and this is not a new crime. This is a mess up. The first time you break the rules, you're in for 3. The second time you break the rules, you're in for 5. The third time you break the rules, you're in for 10. Up to. And then after that, you can have it. You've proven that you cannot follow the rules, and we are focused on you, and the judge can send you back for any amount of time under the sentence. So this system is very fast. I mean, it's very fast. It's very certain, and it's very proportional.
And you were finding it going down from 13 to 14? Where are you on the website?
So, it's the DOC, it's under their data analysis or historical
Yeah, they
documents or
have
something.
they put out a yearly
So
report.
I'm looking at, all intakes, you can look at population trends too by institution. So I'm trying to understand
Yeah.
here where we're looking at, because I'm looking at different data than you're looking at.
Are you
clearly,
looking at
because in 2011, I'm saying population all intakes at 38,000, and in 2015
Oh,
it's
yeah.
down to 35,000.
Okay, those are admissions.
And then population trends daily per organization. When you start looking at it, we start seeing population trends between 2009 and 2015. There's definitely a little bit of an increase that are institutionalized from 4,401 to 5,034. But to me,
5,034,
that's not ginormous by any stretch of the imagination where we can't have capacity.
We only have our capacity is about 5,095 beds.
Okay. Well, we're not. I was going to say, is that after Palmer was closed?
No, that's
with
including Palmer.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just asking.
So that would be a kind of the tipping point.
So that's why I say when we start looking at this data, it's where we pick our point to see our trend line, because how we parse it is important, and where we're pulling the data. I just want to make sure you and I are pulling the same data points.
So this is from Department of Corrections. We didn't make this data up. This is from Department of Corrections, their population data that the commission had when it made it. Sometimes they go back and revise.
So these are projections, though.
Well, the projection's just a
all the way up.
projection. Yeah, that's just, so stop at 2014,
Okay.
right? Because remember, the commission was doing this work in 2015, so this is a projection. Yeah, when we were sitting in chairs in about 2015, using the most recent year's data from 2014, you can see that we were right around 2014. They were right around capacity, and you can see from the trend line. I mean, if you just followed the trend line, the prediction was that it would go up. So. I don't think, I'm not sure, I'm not seeing a lot, but I can follow up with you if
that'd
there's
be fine.
specifics. I'm not
just
seeing.
trying to follow along.
Mr. Dunbar, and then we'll get back.
What
on.
year did Goose Creek open? How many beds was it? And did we bring back people from Colorado or Arizona at that time?
I think they did, yeah.
Yeah, it was Colorado. They moved everyone back up. I can't remember when it opened. It was,
More Department of Corrections question.
Mr. Croft?
Yeah.
When are you going to close?
We can go
Oh,
a little
I'm sorry.
past. We started 10 minutes late. So,
Give me a couple minutes before we get quit.
okay.
Okay.
Keep going, Suzanne. We'll get as far as we can.
So let's talk about what works. So we've talked a little bit about pretrial release. So all the and I remember the commission wanted to be database. So all the research shows that an actuarial risk assessment tool plus professional judgment is more accurate than professional judgment alone. That is why the commission recommended that Alaska adopt the use of a pretrial risk assessment tool, which we have done starting in January of 2018. Also, on the discussion we were having about, well, you know, what does it matter about these people sitting around pretrial? Well, it really does matter when you send people to prison, especially low-risk people, people who have a number of pro-social things in their lives. You can send them to prison, and you can actually increase the rate that they're going to recidivate. And so that's something to watch out for. We don't want to make people worse. We want to reserve prison for high and moderate risk people, people that need to be in prison, and we don't want to mix them with low risk people. We really don't want to do that, because when you mix high risk and low risk people, I can promise you the high risk people don't get better. It's the other way around all the time. It's the low risk people who then move into a higher risk category. So we want to be careful about who we're putting in prison. We want to be smart about it, and not just because we want to save money. And I want to really emphasize that a lot of people have misunderstood the Commission's mission as just saving money, and that is just not right. It's saving money without impacting public safety, and one goal that the Commission wants is to reduce recidivism. I mean, we still have our eyes on that prize. We're still going to be measuring that recidivism rate, and we want it to go down. Also, as Commissioner Steiner mentioned, unsecured bonds are as effective at achieving public safety and court appearance as secured bonds. So that was some data the Commission had. And I mentioned before, under the old system, the old pretrial release system, 37% of people who were released, who made bail or released on their own recognizance, actually were rearrested during the pretrial period. 37%. So that's another figure that I think we can do better than that. Also, we had data that over a third of detained defendants actually were at low risk or very low risk for new criminal activity. So again, because we were so focused on using money, we weren't focused on risk, and we tended to sort of keep low risk people in and not and allow higher risk people to come out. Not all the time, but it was not as good as it could have been. So then here's another, there's just been studies and studies and studies. Does more incarceration result in less crime? And it is, so there's been just tons of criminological research on this. And it is true that when incarceration increased during the 1990s, people now believe that that increase in incarceration was associated with between 10 and 30% of the reduction in crime. Remember, crime was going up in the 90s. Elsewhere, and well, it was pretty high here too in the 90s, and then it's been going down. Some of that was as a result of incarceration. Why? Well, you're imprisoning some high-risk people. You're keeping them off the streets so they can't reoffend, and that is does have some effect on crime. However, at this point, with our incarceration rate in the United States, we are at the margins of usefulness for further incarceration. So we have gotten the bang for our buck that we can get by increasing incarceration. And increasing it more, we are getting no benefit. We are spending a lot of money, and we're not likely to get any benefit because we already incarcerate an awful lot of people in the United States.
Yeah.
So I just have a very basic philosophical question here. So clearly you're showing that increased incarceration had a correlation with decreasing crime rate. So the converse then would be, if you decrease the incarceration penalty, you're going to have an increase in crime rate. Is that at all a reasonable assumption?
I think the more productive way of looking at it is that you want to be smarter about who you incarcerate.
Okay, I haven't really pontificated, and I will try to refrain from doing so today. But one of the things that's really challenging me about the presentation is two things, actually.
One of the things is two things?
Yeah, well, there's a lot more, but one is we keep talking about, well, I heard earlier in the presentation, the point about bail, it's basically the haves versus the have-nots. But the real thing that I'm hearing from my constituents is the fact is bail was a tool that was used by judges to keep dangerous people from the public. And so again, when you look at bail, some will say the point of bail is not to manage public safety, But if that person is not committing another crime, I would say that's managing public safety. So I think that discussion of bail being a tool for judges to use to protect the public is a valid one to have. And the other thing in all my criminal justice classes that I took, there was a lot of discussion about there has to be an adequate deterrence in order to make sure people aren't going to, I mean, there's some people in the population, no matter what the deterrence is, they're going to commit the crime anyway. But there are a number of people that if there's an adequate deterrence, that is one factor in ensuring that we drop those recidivism rates.
So Amy, is this a question or sort of?
No, it is a question. No, it's not. It's a
Well,
question.
just on time, get to the question.
I'm trying to, and it's set up. Everybody else got their time, so I'm just trying to get it in there because I know I'm not going to get another chance. So my question to the commission is, you know, we don't want to mix low risk and high risk people. I think we can all agree that's reasonable. But when we take out a significant portion, which the public is telling me, and I agree, that deterrence is one of those factors that isn't really part of this equation anymore. Because if we take out the punishment, a significant deterrence to commit crime is that.
Okay, how about, have we taken out deterrence? Anyone who wants to?
No, one of the things, first of all, the sentences for the felony offenses were simply realigned to a prior existing presumptive term. They weren't taken away. They were just moved to straddle what was pre-existing in the middle basic line. What happened a number of years ago is, based upon a Supreme Court case, they needed a range. So they started the middle at the bottom. And so what happened was all the sentences increased, just shot up, and they've been going up ever
And
since.
was that in the 90s?
No, that
No, it was
happened
in
in
2005.
And then what the data was showing was those increased sentences don't provide any deterrent effect,
Right.
any additional deterrent effect, and don't provide any impact on recidivism. They were just costing money and not doing anything.
Right.
So they were realigned for all felons, just to sort of straddle that
Yeah.
pre-existing middle sentence. That was it. The penalties are still there. You know, you can be at and near a.
Yeah, so there's no evidence that a longer sentence has a more deterrent value than a shorter sentence. So
In fact, short.
So if I steal a car and I go to jail for a year, or if I steal a car and I go to jail for 5 years, you're saying there's no deterrence there?
There wasn't.
Or in this case, we steal a car and we.
on recidiv, no.
There was no additional deterrent effect.
So you're talking about deterrence, or are you talking about, I mean, the difference is the one person's in jail for 5 years and the other person is in jail for 1 year. That's not deterrence, that's, what you're talking about is they're contained and they're not able to recidivate. The period.
What I'm saying is, if somebody steals a car and I know I'm going to go to jail for 5 years, if I get out and say, oh man, I'm just going to get a slap on the wrist and I can steal another car,
Yeah.
to me, we've removed that deterrent. We've significantly reduced it.
So that is really, that is the way we think. That's certainly the way I think. But really, for many criminals, it's the certainty of whether they're going to get caught.
There's a reason. Can I take my shot?
It's whether they're going to get
Well-
caught is playing more of a role in their decision to engage in criminal activity, to the extent there's any thinking at all going on, right? It's the thinking about, am I going to get caught? And it's not as much thinking about, well, let's see, I'm a second-time C felony offender, so that puts me in the 1 to 5
Right, so you
presumptive
guys
range.
said, and we get,
Okay,
there
and
isn't
then-
a lot of evidence, or there is evidence to say that it's
And then on-
not true, that obvious
yeah.
idea that
Right.
just simply increasing the sentence is going to have a deterrent effect.
So that's the
She's saying
data we
it's-
have. If people have
Okay.
other studies they want to give us, that's great too. But let me just say on the bail thing, judges can still use bail. I mean, let's not, they can still use bail, and they do use bail. So yeah, they can, and they do. It's just, there's some instances where
Some instances where they
where
were
it's not
precluded.
available, but it's certainly available in the vast majority of
Okay.
instances.
So on the sort of, we're a committee of the Assembly. We can give speeches to each other if we want. We were here really to learn from them about the data they have and the basis they have, and to answer questions. So I'd prefer we can educate each other by all going out for
Those
coffee.
were
or
real
no.
questions I had.
yeah, no, that was
Well, okay.
we got it. We're good.
So
Increasing incarceration.
Fred, did you want to ask a question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so the national statistics and the people who've gone down the road, say in general, there's a third of the people who are criminal minds, no matter what you do, they're gonna keep reoffending. There's very little hope. There's a third of them that are straight people, they made a bad decision on the worst day of their life. They've learned their lesson, and they got their hands slapped and they're embarrassed, and they're probably not gonna offend again. And there's a third in the middle. You got a shot at them. But the reason this long sentencing doesn't work, you put a guy in jail for 3 months or so, he maybe can keep his job. He doesn't lose his family, he doesn't lose his friends and so on and so forth, and he's got a place to go back to. If the longer, for some of them, the longer you keep them, all those natural contacts and all hope is gone, and you put him in the world's best graduate school on how to be a jerk and a crook. So what you're trying to do is, the people who won't offend again, probably, is give them the best transition back to civilian life. The guys in the middle, give them the best shot. And the guys who are, there's no hope, don't waste your resources on those guys. But there's that sweet spot in the sentencing. And that's why we have some data from other places, but that's why we need to do it. 2 other quick things. In our state, I made a trip around to see a lot of judges. Most judges don't get a chance to be a judge. The cases are pled out, prosecutors stack the charges, Alaska Natives who tend to fess up, they get disciplined. So the judges are saying, I don't get a chance to use my wisdom and experience and the tools we have because they're pled out. The prosecutors say, all those guys are guilty anyways. What we're doing is expediting the process.
That's it.
And and one other thing I missed. You heard me ask this question 10 months ago, and I think Chief Dole said a police officer arrests a guy on the second offense for shoplifting. He can call a magistrate and get permission to take him to jail. Don't have to turn him loose and just give him a ticket. And Monaghan and our prosecutor said that's absolutely true. I believe the chief and certainly Monaghan has said we've got a real job to inform our police officers that they have that authority on the second arrest, put that guy in jail. Most of the time only take a phone call.
You heard him swear it was a question.
Pardon?
I said you swore it was a question, but
3 more
anyway,
slides.
that's
3
fine.
more slides. Okay.
Yeah.
Before we leave this slide, I do
no.
want to give a quick shout out to Chief Dahl, who's here. The people who look at this stuff really believe that better police strategies and police technology actually have contributed to a decrease in crime. And the fact of the matter is increased police presence decreases criminal activity. That's just a fact. Commissioner Steiner was talking about swift, certain, and proportional sanctions. I think we explained that in the community supervision arena, where we've got people that need to be taught how to follow the rules. And they need to be taught quickly. I mean, it's just like with your child. You would not say to your child who misbehaved that there's a 50% chance in 6 months that I'm going to give you a sanction for that, but I'm not telling you what it is. No. You say there's a 100% chance that you're going to have a consequence, and here's what it's going to be. And it's just a basic behavioral principle. We've now baked that into our community supervision.
And it's going to be right now, not 6 months.
And it has to be right now. It can't be 6 months from now. That's just, it's terrible.
This stemmed from a program in Hawaii that we implemented here. It's called Hope in Hawaii. It's called PACE here. And people were being picked up the very same day that the violations were being alleged, and picked up that day and having their case adjudicated that day. And then the sanction was immediately imposed, and it was maybe a couple days to make sure they didn't lose their job but spend time in jail. What Hawaii learned from this process is that people don't even need to spend the night. They can arrest them in the morning, release them at night. They get the same impact in reductions in contacts with the police.
But we do them for up to
that
3
they do
days.
for spending the night.
But to your question on deterrence, which I think is really what you're concerned with, and it's what a lot of people are concerned with, and the deterrence effect of that, it's the swiftness and the certainty that really deters people.
Got it.
it-
Go,
Amount of
Suzanne.
time doesn't
Go.
matter.
Incorporating rewards and incentives is important. I talked about sort of getting people off the probation officers' caseloads, the ones who are following the rules, the ones who are doing their treatment, the ones who are paying their restitution. Why are they going to be clogging up the probation officers' caseload here in Anchorage when they could be cut loose to go back to their community, and the officer then can focus their resources on the ones who aren't doing those things, the ones who've proven that they can't follow the rules. And so that is now a part of the community supervision laws and policies. And front-loading resources. I really wanted to talk about this. So, obviously, so the state has invested $3 million in FY17 and 18 in reentry services. And that is really important, and I think you had presentations from Partners for Progress and their reentry center. And remember when I was talking about people, how quickly they reoffend if they're going to reoffend after they're released? I mean, a significant percentage of people reoffend within the first week of their release, which is shocking to me. If I'd just gotten out of jail, I wouldn't be looking to reoffend. But anyway, so...
Was that really front load? I mean, the out of jail aspects came a year and a half before these resources got online, and their effort. I'm not.
No, FY17, which would have been 2016. This investment came with 91. The first year of 91.
It took us a long time to see it. I think we are
Yes.
seeing changes now
It
in
does
early
take-
18.
It does take
Well,
a
so
while
how
to
is
get
that
money out on the
front-loaded?
street.
Isn't that backloading? That is, we're going to take the criminal justice savings in the prison up front, and we're going to get to, and I think finally that's hitting the street sort of now with the schedule that enabled it and all that. So,
All I can tell you is that the money was given with the reforms, and
okay.
I
Anyway,
mean,
that's
that's all I
an
can
important
say.
part. Keep going.
It came at the same. It was simultaneous. The other thing that's important to know, and not to bring up a controversial subject, but
No, we wouldn't want
right,
that.
but Medicaid reform. So the Department of Corrections and Health and Social Services have gotten like over 800, it's probably 1,000 now, people coming out of prison signed up for Medicaid services who never would have qualified before. And what does that mean? That means that they can now have medical coverage for behavioral health and substance abuse treatment. So it's a little known pocket, but those are sort of single men who weren't qualifying for any other types of coverage.
So that we've been doing a lot on
And
that.
this
That-
is huge.
Well, it's huge, but at the same time, there's been, it appears, cuts in or shifting to that as the model. That is, that's great, and that could be a model for more. It's not clear to me that it's more yet, that some people are just saying, pay for it with Medicaid. And so some of the grant-based has gone off. Really trying to figure out whether treatment beds in this town have gone up or down, I've been struggling with for a year, and I don't have a firm conclusion yet.
Yeah.
I worry
There's
that it's
clearly-
about the same.
There's clearly not enough available.
Yes.
Right.
It needs to be
Right.
immediately available.
And
Yeah.
whether it's going up or shifting funding and staying the same or going down is hard to tell.
But
Keep
these are
going, we're on a
certainly
roll.
people who weren't covered before. That's it.
Oh, wow. We get through it. We didn't get through the issue, but got through the presentation. Really wanted to do that.
Thank you.
So now questions, and if you can, keep them to short
Yes,
questions.
I read through this thing on SB 54.
Uh-huh.
It looked like a ton of things were changed over your opposition. Is that correct? Or you made no recommendation on those?
Just no
There
recommendation.
was a lot of things added to that didn't come through the commission,
Yeah.
but the major provisions in SB 54 did come through the commission.
Would you categorize SB 54 as a small, medium, or very large sort of pullback of SB 54?
I wouldn't call it a large pullback, and I wouldn't call it necessarily a major pullback. There was one provision that I think repudiated a particular policy, but overall effect of it was it substantially addressed the concerns that had been raised at the time. And in fact, with regard to jail time for theft, regard to jail time for first-time non-aggravated C felonies, and for violating conditions of release, it in effect evened out and made the scheme of jail and progression smoother and more consistent with what was causing people concern. It did address all of those things. There were a bunch of other things that were attached to it that had various changes, but the major provisions were significant, but essentially evened out reform rather than.
What's the status on the two different bail fixes?
One is, I believe, in the Senate Rules Committee, and there's one that just got out of House Judiciary. And the versions that were in Senate Finance or Senate Judiciary and House Judiciary, they were measured and targeted to address this problem that you were talking about, was that they're not considered. It would allow an out-of-state conviction. There were different sets of circumstances. The Senate one said any out-of-state conviction. The one in the House had it targeted to felonies and person crimes with a 5-year look back. They could be considered. It would take you out of the mandatory and put you in the presumptive OR release, which would allow the judge, under certain circumstances, to add monetary bail. But under all conditions, monetary or mandatory OR and otherwise, the judge was free to put on conditions as necessary, including supervision. And this is the new part: supervision by the pretrial enforcement division. So that's always available, even under mandatory OR. You're just talking about monetary bail.
Yeah.
And so the commission, has the commission taken a position on those bills?
That wasn't pushed through the commission. But I think
The commission did have recommendations that that went into some version of 54, and some of those were in and some weren't, and it just sort of went. The legislative process was pretty raucous.
So when the example we've been talking about, when the woman's saying, "We know you have a felony. We know you're a felon in possession from California." And we can charge that. We have enough confidence in that we can charge it. But we cannot look at it for bail purposes, and we have to let you go.
can't look at it for
Hold on, let me finish. Own recognizance, the trouble is before. You're saying they can put conditions like what on?
Pretrial supervision,
electronic monitoring.
electronic
GPS,
monitoring,
house arrest.
GPS, house
They can do
arrest.
everything they can do in any other case.
Check in with the
except secured bail.
Check in with the pretrial
You're
services.
interrupting him.
Oh yeah, I know.
You're
Sorry.
going to a
But
new level.
Check in with the pretrial services officer every day, every week, whatever.
Yeah.
And get
all
a-
of the conditions are available to the judge
Yeah.
that are available in any other case.
Why I asked that question, too. We're out of time, though. We got a little late. We're going to digest this, and then hopefully, if we haven't been too rude, have you back.
We'd be
Any
happy to come
things
back.
you would like to conclude with? You get the last words. All three of you, or
Well, I will say one thing that we really need to focus on and do, I feel, sitting in the victim services, is that figure out things like when your car is returned trashed, how can we make you whole? Because, that would go a long ways towards making me feel a little better as a victim versus waiting for the next 10 years for my $2 a month restitution check. You know what? That's not going to help me with my deductible. And I still keep calling you Senator Dyson. Fred worked a lot with us on terms of putting through a bunch of recommendations that we need to do in order to really start focusing more on the victim side of our criminal justice system and make sure that they are. And so they haven't quite been rolled out the way we'd like to in legislative. I think the other thing to recognize is that as a commission, we put forward recommendations. I went back and looked at the original recommendations versus what passed in Senate Bill 91, and it's not really reflective. And so while we still, I still stand by criminal justice reform, absolutely there were some changes in there that were what they felt should pass. And so with everything that we do, there's going to be changes. And so we would just really like, as these bills come up, where we're really looking at restitution reform and how to make sure that victims are compensated and that we provide some kind of system that includes them, that, as Assembly, you would stand up and support those also in a very vigorous way.
in your guys' opinion, did the legislature take your recommendations and take the savings up front, like take the savings too early?
So I will say, as a person doing this work on the streets, I think that our systems, it takes us a little while to ramp up.
Yeah.
And I don't think we communicated that as well to our legislative. So I think when we were talking about the money that got put on the street, that did get put on the street, but it had to go through a grant process,
Right.
which means the RFP had to be written,
Right.
and then we had to beef up our capacity and try to figure out how to get people hired in order to do
Right.
the reentry work. And so I think what happened is you saw changes, but the system on the streets didn't catch up for a year, because all the people weren't hired and all the pieces weren't in place.
Translating for you, it happened later than we wanted, but maybe not through legislative malice, just through
I don't
things.
think there was any misintent.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I wasn't asking you, I was asking her.
I-
Saying amen.
It's a conflict of interest.
There was no misintent. I think that we just, we were like, oh yeah, here, let's do this work, and then all of a sudden we realized we got to find people qualified. When we're talking about doing treatment, I mean,
Okay,
it's
I just want to make sure I
challenging.
heard you right. Great.
Yeah.
Quinn or Suzanne?
Yeah, I mean, one of the key things I think to remember is the formula for spending more money and not making a safer community is well known to us. That's what we were doing, and that's what other states have done. Here's the potential for having a huge impact on our communities. And I don't view this as a money-saving operation. That the money that's saved should be diverted towards treatment. That's what's going to maximize the benefits of the initiatives that we recommended. We recommended initiatives that even without treatment wouldn't have a negative effect on the communities. That's what we were looking at. But if you really want to drive down recidivism rates and drive down harm to the community, is really focus on finding rehabilitative programs that can supplement these initiatives, because the foundation for success is right here. Spending more money and getting terrible outcomes is also known to us. And, I can only say that funding the programs, measuring these reforms, and getting really hard data to see which reforms are working and which programs work is key, because we can't be spending money on things that aren't working. We need to spend them on the things that are working, and you can have a real impact on your community in this way.
Suzanne?
Well, I would just like to offer, really, my contact information is here, and I really hope that all of you or any of you who hear from constituents about either a particular case or a general policy will please call or email, and we try to make ourselves available, really, to either explain. I mean, sometimes people don't exactly understand what happened, and you can help at least explain what happened, whether you like what happened or not, or if you've got questions about a particular policy or how it's being implemented, or if you see something that doesn't look right, I hope you'll get in touch with us, because we would like to be involved in the discussion, and it should be a discussion. And I'm just
Don't say it if you don't mean it.
no, I
but
mean it.
okay.
I mean, really, I do it. We do it now. People contact us. We've done a lot of work with the media, actually, to explain. I mean, just to sort of at least to understand what the purpose was. And even if you don't agree, at least you'll understand. You'll have that information. So I mean it, and I'll even give people my cell phone number if you have things that you want to. No, seriously, I do it already, so I'm happy to do it, and I would like to do it because I sort of feel like if there's going to be criticism, it should be accurate criticism, and let's just clear up the misunderstandings, and then we'll get into the stuff we disagree about.
Great, we'll come back to it. Thank you all, and thank you for coming. We're adjourned.
Good job.